an architecture media podcast supported by the Australian Institute of Architects, produced on Boonwurrung country.
Welcome to Design Speaks Weekly, a podcast that explores the biggest stories in Australian architecture and design. I'm your host, Georgia Burks, and today I speak with Melbourne-based architect Clare Cousins about the long-held notion that architecture is a luxury only available to the few, and how the industry can change this assumption. But first, here's the latest news headlines from Architecture AU.
In the news this week, the shortlist for the 2026 Houses Awards has been revealed, showcasing 170 inventive and inspiring homes. Notable among the shortlisted houses were innovative approaches to material reuse, adaptive retention, and long-term sustainability. And Architecture Australia is inviting architects, students, graduates, and allied professionals to share their vision for the future of the architectural profession. The call-out is for an upcoming dossier explaining what architecture could look like in 2050, which will be guest edited by Blake Hillebrand of Kirsten Thompson Architects and Gina Engelhardt of Hassel. Those are the headlines for this week. For the full stories and more news, visit architectureau.com. I'm Adair Rinder. It's Tuesday, June 9.
Clare Cousins established her practice, Clare Cousins Architects, in 2005. Since then, her firm has designed and delivered a mix of social housing typologies, as well as cultural, private residential, and workplace projects. The studio has found a balance between projects that sustain architectural practice financially and the projects that address broader social needs. In today's conversation, I speak with Clare about how architects can play a meaningful role in shaping an inclusive built environment designed for the 99%. Hello, Clare, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Clare, the claim that architects design for the top 1% is a common criticism of contemporary architecture. From your perspective, how can architects change this perception and emphasise that good design is for everyone?
Yeah, it is a challenge, I suppose when we started practice 20 odd years ago, most of the work we were doing was single residential, alts and ads or new builds, and that very much is you really are working for the 1%. It is a privileged few, even when the budgets are small. There's just so much time. Essentially, those clients are buying time, the designer's time, to essentially come up with a completely bespoke solution to their kind of housing needs. And so while that, we love that, and it's kind of our first love of architecture, and we'll always continue to do those kind of projects, it has been really interesting. I suppose it actually, probably the first one that came to us was, I think it was actually because we hadn't even really done a new house. It was quite early in our project, in our practice, and it was after the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires, and there was an opportunity. The institute with, I think it was Vic Urban at the time, kind of ran a kind of set up a structure for architects to kind of provide pro bono housing. And so in some respects that was a way for us, because we couldn't break into new houses, it was a way for us to kind of come up with that. And they had the Quantity Surveyors Association kind of price them, and we really tried to, essentially it was like a cranked shed, hinge house we called it, and was priced at about $270,000, and it was really for regional people who'd lost their homes, which obviously, and so it did need to be really cost effective to work in those conditions. And that was a fantastic, I suppose there was no obligation for us to continue it through, but we ended up kind of meeting with these potential clients who were kind of taking our free design, so to speak, and we ended up kind of continuing the documentation for them. And in some respects that triggered it. I mean, that's kind of unusual in that that's still a bespoke project, but it has always been something that we've thought long and hard about, that how can good design should be available for everyone, whether it's in schools, in public spaces. And then it probably wasn't then until we kind of got involved with Nightingale. And while that's not affordable housing, that's kind of, privately owned housing, but just even changing those levers of how is an apartment more cost effective than buying a house. And then we've kind of moved into doing quite a lot of social housing, which we really love. And we've also done 2 specialist disability apartment buildings. So how can we bring a design lens to projects that are quite typically very kind of institutional? And now we've kind of been starting to look at, how can we pull more levers, because the cost of construction, the cost of labor, materials and even the regulatory kind of complexity of projects, how can we pull levers to make bespoke housing more cost effective? So we've kind of got a project that we're doing at the moment which employs more prefabrication. It's a kind of a small house. We can build it in 6 months rather than 12. So we're kind of also interested in how we can look at some of those techniques to actually make bespoke housing, not everything being, now 3 million's the new norm, it's kind of ludicrous. And so it's a small house, but we're able to deliver it in a much shorter time because we're using different construction systems.
So you would say that, I guess, architects can help change that perception and emphasize that it's kind of for everyone by getting involved really and experimenting with different ways to make construction a bit cheaper.
Yeah, I think so. I think we've just always got to be open to new possibilities. And I also think there's a lot of exciting construction methodologies that will be happening in the next decade. Like you kind of start to see this kind of robotics using, like how can we, those, I don't even know what you call them, but it almost looks like 3D printing, houses and things. And so how can we start to think about employing some of that new technology where you actually, and it's not about making people redundant or trades on site. I think trades are going to be highly valuable, people that work with their hands in the AI future. But we need to, the cost of labour has become so ridiculous. That's really leading to what makes the cost of construction so expensive.
And speaking about the cost of labour, but from the architect's perspective, projects with greater social impact still require a substantial amount of work from architects, and the budget allocated to these types of projects may not meet a typical architect's fee that would support the hours of work required. How have you structured your practice to deliver pro bono or low fee projects such as Shiel Street in North Melbourne without compromising financial stability of your studio?
Shiel Street, if we use that as an example, so that was 78 apartments, was designed for Housing Choices, who are a not-for-profit community housing provider. But the difference with that too, though, is there is replicable elements. So we're not designing one bespoke kitchen, one bespoke bathroom, for clients. We're designing 78 apartments at once. It's all being delivered as a single thing. We came up with one kitchen colour scheme, one kitchen typology, which can be adapted to different apartments. So that's where you are starting to get, with that replicable, you are getting much more cost effectiveness. So if you actually kind of broke down what the fees are per apartment compared to a bespoke house, which these days can be hundreds of thousands of dollars of fees for an architect, because it literally takes thousands of hours to take it from concept through the concept design, the town planning, and the design development, the documentation. And then the other one is even the significant amount of time over 12 to 18 months on site, even working with really good builders and really comprehensive, well-documented sets of drawings. There's still so many hours in making those decisions. And that's very out of reach for the vast majority of the population.
And would you say that it's healthy for a practice to sort of be catering to both types of projects to help with, I guess, the business of the studio?
Yeah, we find, I think because, we're like 15, so we're kind of in that, a small to medium size practice. We don't know how we would do it if we didn't have both the bespoke and the developer clients. The developer clients, development projects, require quite a lot of resources, like people on the project. They move really fast. They've often got really tight timeframes and deadlines, but they can also grind to a glaring halt, quickly. That hasn't happened much with our projects, thankfully, at the moment. And so in some respects, the house projects, much less time critical. We're always very conscientious with the kind of deliverables of how we run those projects. We don't want them dragging out for ages. They already take 2 or 3 years as it is. But the timeframes, there's much more flexibility. So for us as a business model, having bespoke housing and developer clients is a perfect kind of combination, just even from a logistics of trying to resource a practice, which is a really constant challenge for practices. You've either got too much work or not enough. But also I think there's culturally in the office, there's a real interest because they're at the polar opposites. You've got the kind of emotion, the kind of, more budget and kind of opportunities to kind of be embedding kind of craft and things in the projects and more fine details. Whereas at the complete opposite end, the social housing, we kind of also love that for its absolute kind of rigor and efficiency. And I think it kind of gives, they both kind of actually feed each other.
And I guess that sort of speaks to the capabilities that architects have in terms of problem solving across different typologies, different clients, different budgets. How does designing for the 99% change the way you design, who you work with, and what gets built? Like, what trade-offs do you think you face?
I think the realization we've had in the last few years is if we're going to do apartment work or replicable work, which I suppose is where there's multiples, we're much more interested in working for a community housing provider. But I think for us, it's about firstly having a kind of values aligned client. And the community housing providers often, even though the budgets are incredibly tight and lean, they're regularly holding the asset for 40 years. So they're actually invested in building things that will last, building things that will be cost effective to live in, that they have low running costs so that residents don't have kind of large utility bills. And so that's the kind of why, like that's how we choose those clients. And then for us, I think we often talk about, we don't know who's moving into the building. We're interested, the buildings often cater to quite a diverse community. So it might be, ones, twos, threes. There might be some specialist disability apartments, those kind of things. But the way we sort of thought about it, when we started doing Nightingale about 8 years ago, was how would we want to live in these apartments? What are some of those kind of domestic qualities that we try and bring in from our house, bespoke house projects? How do you make something feel more personal and a home, and that people can personalize that? But you've still got to have this kind of ability that it can adapt to a lot of people, but it's just sometimes very, very small little thoughts. It might be how the kitchen or a shelf or somewhere to drop your keys, or it's really small kind of fundamentals that can make that feel good. But it's something that I suppose we really enjoy that. And then what's really interesting is when you go back to a project once it's been occupied, and you sometimes get to speak or meet with the residents, and the way that they say this has completely changed. They've come from this place, they've moved to here, and it's completely changed their outlook to life. And I think you can't underestimate how important design is. It's that the environment that we put ourselves in has to our everyday fundamental well-being. So it's incredibly important.
Given the constraints of the economic and political frameworks, particularly at this moment in time, what responsibility do architects have to challenge the systems that they work within?
I feel like as architects, we're constantly dealing with constraints and having to overcome obstacles, whether it be regulatory, political, bureaucratic, or sort of red tape. And I feel like it's kind of so normalized that we're dealing with it all the time that sometimes you don't even realize that you're just getting on with it and kind of finding solutions. It's very easy sometimes to kind of just head down in kind of delivery. And I think that it is good sometimes to kind of take stock, think, and kind of sometimes, just go, well, just because that's the regulation, or that's the kind of, let's say, planning envelope, that Shiel Street's a good example, actually. That had it's the city of Melbourne, but it was in North Melbourne, the suburb of North Melbourne, and it had a kind of a ziggurat, a wedding cake typical envelope. And we just felt that was really going to be it was really inefficient structurally, which adds to a lot of costs. B, it's not a very good urban outcome. And so we kind of really, and that went through the planning minister as part of the big build, but we still had to kind of present to the OVGA and City of Melbourne. And we were able to kind of really convince them that the two sort of step, like a street wall and an upper form, was much stronger. So it's maybe not the best example, but it kind of, just because something says it has to be this way, I think we need to be kind of thinking what's going to give a better outcome for multiple reasons, and kind of be great advocates, for good design and what's going to benefit the residents long term.
I think that's a great example, Claire, of sort of saying, you'll have these regulations or this brief that comes to you, and architects have that skill to think it through and problem solve and come up with better solutions or other ideas to just talk about and have that conversation with, which I think then is what challenges the system or clients or stakeholders for a better outcome.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not a building. It's also that thing of sometimes, sometimes clients don't come with a very strong brief. They might have really the pragmatic brief of the bits and pieces they want, like they need 70 apartments. But it's also that thing of sitting back, and architects are incredibly skilled at looking at the big picture, breaking down a problem, really thinking about that. And I think we really have to kind of harness and really demonstrate, I think as architects, we all know that together, but I think so often people outside of architecture, even within the built environment, they don't come to us enough for that. They often are looking to other sectors. They're looking to the property council, or they're looking to real estate agents for that. And architects, I think we've got to use our voices to kind of really advocate what is good for, our cities, both for the building but also for the kind of community beyond.
Completely agree, Claire. Look, we've come to the end of our episode already, so I'd like to ask you, what's something you've changed your mind about?
I think in the same vein of what we've kind of been discussing, if you had have asked me 10 years ago, architects always love to kind of bag out the developer as the bad guy. And it was really funny, actually. I think nothing like falling into doing our own development as part of the village with 5 other architects. So we were architect and developer. It completely changed, and I'm sure the rest of my co-developers would say the same, that the architecture bit was fine, but being the developer, the risk that you're taking on, and we were also doing it with zero profit or actually even remuneration for the kind of development role. We were being paid as architects. So I think look, there's good and bad, but I think I've developed much more kind of empathy for what the risk that they take on to deliver, all of these projects that we need to deliver, Australia-wide. We really need to kind of have great teams, and that's great consultant teams, great builders, great developers. And anyway, so that's definitely something in the last sort of 10 years that I've completely changed my perspective of. And I think the developers will be pleased to hear that they're not the bad guys anymore, necessarily.
I think so too, Claire. I think that's a great answer. And, everyone, we've got to unite to be on the same team to get a great outcome. So completely agree. But Claire, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's been really interesting and enjoyable to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode, which is supported by the Australian Institute of Architects. If you're interested in learning more about how designers can reclaim architecture's role in everyday housing, come along to the Architecture Symposium Designing for the 99% on Friday, 4th of September 2026 at the Sofitel Melbourne on Collins. For more information about this event, head to designspeaks.com.au. Be sure to subscribe, share, or leave a rating if you're enjoying this podcast. I'm Georgia Burks, and this has been Design Speaks Weekly. Design Speaks Weekly is produced on Boonwurrung country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture.